Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Ask Dave. And what were you asking, Dave? Well, actually, the question was, are conductors necessary? And I think that's a very, very interesting question. As someone who's played under zillions of them, I've often asked myself that question too. Maybe a better formulation, though, would be, what are conductors for? Because it depends on what you expect out of music, and it depends on the music itself. Some pieces of music require conductors. Some pieces of music do not. So let's talk in very practical terms, because, this is stuff that you'll see in your perusal of the modern discography. In general, Baroque music does not require a conductor. Unless it's an opera or oratorio, then it does require a conductor. This is a purely practical feat of technical gymnastics. Baroque orchestral music, for example, concerti grossi, let's say, were written for very, very small orchestras. They would have been led from the keyboard continuo, probably by the composer, or from the first violin. But there's a leader. There's always someone in charge. That's the important thing to keep in mind. Whether or not we have a conductor in front of the orchestra or not, somebody has to take charge of the proceedings. Someone has to organize the group. Someone has to tell them when to start. They can't all just decide individually when they feel like it. At its base, the job of the conductor is to maintain ensemble, to keep everybody together. But you don't need a full-time professional hotshot conductor to give a downbeat. You don't. Get everyone started. Anybody can do it. Anybody in the group. And that's what happens with some of our larger chamber orchestras, for example, like the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra, or one of those larger groups that plays without a conductor. Normally, they select somebody who's going to be their leader du jour, and that person will be in charge of the basics of either maintaining ensemble or deciding collective issues of interpretation, how much of a retard to make where it's marked in the score, or how long a pause should be, things like that. So someone is in charge. That's even true in a string quartet. It really is. The person in charge can sometimes, even in a chamber group, is just the person who has the melody, and everyone else is accompanying. It's their job to listen to the person who has the tune and follow what they do. So the idea that there is this superfluous head, ornament, who's standing up there waving their hands around. Well, yes, in a sense, they are superfluous in some ways, which we'll get to in a moment. In other ways, they're quite necessary. Somebody in charge is necessary. That somebody does not have to be a conductor. Now, in the classical period of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, we still were missing what we know today as the conductor. The position didn't exist. It really didn't, except in theaters. Because for theatrical music and opera, as I said before, whether it's Baroque or anything else, you need somebody to coordinate between the orchestra and the stage. I mean, they didn't have orchestra pits in those days. The orchestra was on the same level as everybody else. But you still had, singers up here, orchestra down here, backstage things, entrances and exits, stuff happening. And it required somebody to direct traffic. And that's what conductors did. They directed traffic. Now, as I was saying, in the classical period, rehearsals were few and far between. There's a very, very famous letter from Haydn to the folks at Oxford, where he was going to get his honorary doctorate, and he was going to play a bunch of symphonies, including the Oxford Symphony number 92 and a couple of the earlier ones. And he said to them in this letter, due to the many special and unusual effects that I have created in these works, it would be really nice if you could give at least one rehearsal. I mean, that was a big deal in those days. Players were like, Broadway show pit players or Hollywood, players, or you just hired an orchestra and these people could do anything. They were very, very highly experienced musicians, but the music had to be of a certain type, a type with which they were familiar. Otherwise, they would have problems, and those problems would be ironed out in rehearsal, and somebody would have to lead the rehearsal. most of what we see in a concert, the conductor's up there doing all this stuff, should be done in rehearsal. There should be very little left to chance on the day when the conductor is in front of the actual audience. I mean, we've heard many stories of orchestras that gave their best performances in the rehearsal, not at the concert, because you can over-rehearse as well. But in general, if the parts are carefully marked, if the ensemble has been properly rehearsed, then there's very little that a conductor should have to do. He's there to have moments of spontaneous and sublime musical insight. Yeah, right, like that's going to happen. Well, sometimes it does. Sometimes things happen on the wing. Most often, it doesn't. It really doesn't, which leads us to the other point I've constantly made, which is that most orchestras are much better than most conductors. That is, the orchestras know the work better because they've played it for decades and decades. If it's a standard repertoire piece, they've played it forever under a whole range of conductors. Not only that, but they have a music library with parts marked by maybe a more famous conductor than the one that they've got. And so the one that they've got gets up there and waves his hands around, but the orchestra is playing what's marked in their parts. And if that conductor has not sent to the orchestra librarian his score marked the way he wants it done well in advance, and if the parts haven't been marked, then he's getting another conductor's interpretation without having any control over it. There's nothing he can do about it. It's actually very, very funny. Most conductors who have standard, they have their body of standard repertoire pieces with their own parts and scores, which they schlep around with them because they don't want to waste time in rehearsal trying to erase what the previous conductor has done. If you look in the New York Philharmonic Archives website, which is a fascinating resource, you can see scores. You could see scores of Mahler First Symphonies marked and things like that, marked by generations of conductors. Mahler, then Bruno Walter, then Leonard Bernstein, that chalked up and marked up by various people. Layers of interpretation. The interpretation's written in, not so much on the podium. So most orchestras are better than most conductors. And from a purely technical point of view, depending on the work, depending what the work requires, how new it is, how tricky it is, how familiar it is to the orchestra, most professional orchestras today can certainly play a piece of music without a conductor. I don't think there's any question about that. You could just get him started, wind him up, and let him go. And excuse me, if the piece of music is of the type that doesn't require much from a conductor, it's like a classical symphony or a neoclassical work from the 20th century, Stravinsky or Hindemith or one of those things where you just sort of rev it up and it doesn't change tempo much in a particular movement and everybody just has to count and play, then you're in business. But there are many, many, many works that require conductors because they were either written in the Romantic style, which requires freedom of tempo. It asks for a lot of interpretive doodads from somebody, and that person has to be the conductor. Then you got to have somebody up front. You just do. The music needs it. It's going to sound stiff and dry and emotionless unless there's somebody who's generating the concept that guides the performance. So it's not a yes or no question. From a purely technical point of view, orchestras don't need conductors. They don't need conductors to count. They don't need conductors even to give entrances after the thing gets going. There's a famous video of Leonard Bernstein doing the finale of Haydn's 88th Symphony where he doesn't conduct. He just sits there and he smiles and nods and winks and smirks. And you can see he's trying really hard not to raise his hands. And he said so. He said it was the hardest thing he ever did in his life was stand there and not raise his hands. But one of the most wonderful things about Bernstein conducting was that there was often a moment where he would just put down his baton and listen. He did that in the middle of the first movement, I'll never forget, of Mahler's Sixth Symphony with the Vienna Philharmonic, of all things. But the music is in march tempo. It's going whoomp, 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 dum, bum, ba-dum, da-da-da-da. What's he going to do? He's doing this? Like they need that? You've got the whole bass section doing this, basically marking time. On the other hand, if you have piece of music like an Ives symphony or something that's poorly written. Schumann symphonies, something that needs someone to clarify what's going on, it really helps to have a conductor because you have to adjust balances and all that stuff. But again, much of that takes place in rehearsals. It does not take place on the day when the performance is going on. Preparation is everything, I believe. I really do. And orchestras without conductors may require a little more preparation to coordinate certain elements of something, but they do it. They do it all the time. Chamber orchestras without conductors are no longer a thing. It's not unusual anymore. And not just Baroque. I mean, they play contemporary music. They play everything. They play romantic music. I mean, the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra does beautiful recordings of like Dvorak and Tchaikovsky string serenades. If it's a small enough ensemble, if the players respond to each other, and if the music, again, isn't so tricky that it requires somebody to make a definitive statement about how long something lasts, like a pause or something, well, you can work it all out in rehearsal. But even when you work it out in rehearsal, someone is in charge. There has to be a guiding brain behind any performance, or you're just going to have a mess. Everybody can't get out there and do everything they want. So I am a little bit, jaded when it comes to conductors because, and this is the final point, often what conductors do is they just get in the way. They just get in the way. They just feel that they have to have ideas, and they think that they're there to tell the orchestra what their fabulous new idea is. And that usually means interfering with what the orchestra already knows and does perfectly well, and the ensemble can do without them at all. And it's very irritating. I've seen it a million times. It happens most often, and if you're a good listener or if you're at a live concert, see what happens at climaxes. It really is. Climaxes and climaxes of volume, either loud or soft. You've got Osmovenska, who has his mannerism, his super duper uber pianissimo that he injects into every single performance he does. And it's artificial and it's obvious and it's usually not marked or not necessary, but you'll hear all of a sudden, the volume goes down to nothing. And you're straining to hear what's going on. That's an affectation. And that requires a conductor because nobody would do that naturally. On the other hand, at a climax, at a loud bit, so many conductors refuse to surrender control, to let the orchestra do what it knows how to do, which is play loudly as a corporate ensemble, as a corporate entity, and make a thrilling climax. So often conductors are controlling what the orchestra is doing, even at very high volume, with the result is that climaxes have no power, they have no impact, they sound restricted and anal, and it's just terrible. One of the bugbears I have, which you've heard in probably many of these videos, is the inability of many of today's orchestras to really play loudly because conductors don't surrender control, which makes the orchestra unlearn things that it supposedly never had any trouble doing. The acme of that issue is today's Berlin Philharmonic. The Berlin Philharmonic under Claudio Abbado could never make a normal loud sound. It was almost impossible for them. It was really very, very strange to listen to it because you could tell he wanted to do something at those climaxes when if a composer knows what he's doing and has marked his dynamics properly and has scored the thing properly, and as I said, some composers did and some composers didn't, conductors shouldn't have to do anything. When you get to a real fortissimo, you should just sit back and let it rip. Bernstein always knew how to do that, by the way. He let it rip. Conductors often need to know when not to conduct. And so many don't because they're too nervous about making an impression. They're too insecure. And they don't trust their players and they don't trust the composer. And they really shouldn't trust themselves. That's who they shouldn't be trusting. So anyway, that's my take on the necessity of conductors. They are necessary at times, unnecessary at other times. They seldom know the difference, and we can hear the difference. I really believe that. But from a technical point of view, the answer to the question is no. Most orchestras that are good, today's top orchestras can play anything without a conductor. Whether you'll get a great performance or not is another question, but whether you get a great performance with a conductor is also the same question. So there you have it, my friends. Keep on listening, and thank you for asking. It's a fun question. Take care.